Welcome, and thank you for joining the channel. Please help this channel by liking and subscribing. We really appreciate it. There are no ads on this video. If you have any stories you would like me to share on this channel, comment below and your story will be featured in the video. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy these 3 creepypastas of cryptids. Journal entry, October 17th, 2024. It's late. I've lost track of time, but the moon is full again tonight. My telescope is old, but reliable. A relic from my father, who always told me to never stop looking up. He was obsessed with space, with the possibility of life beyond Earth. I've taken on that obsession myself, but tonight I wish I hadn't. To whoever reads this, you need to listen carefully. I don't know if I'll have time to finish writing, but I need someone to know what I've seen, what's happening, and what's coming. It started like any other night. The sky was clear, and the moon hung like a beacon in the darkness. I positioned my telescope, aiming for the sea of tranquility, my usual spot. But something was different tonight. There was a shadow across the surface, moving against the stillness of the lunar landscape. At first, I thought it was an anomaly in the lens, maybe dirt or a crack, but it wasn't. The shadow grew larger. It wasn't just drifting, it was crawling. My pulse quickened as I adjusted the focus. What I saw, God help me, wasn't a shadow at all. It was something else entirely. A figure, or rather, many figures, stretched out like black tendrils across the lunar surface. Their forms moved in an unnatural, jerking manner, as though they were flickering between realities. I couldn't tell how large they were, but they dwarfed the craters around them. I kept staring, not wanting to believe it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, slithering across the moon, growing in numbers and mass, and then I saw it. The center of all of them. There was something huge, something buried deep in the moon itself, starting to break through the surface. Its sheer size was impossible to comprehend, like a mountain rising from the depths. The tendrils, those things, seemed to be feeding from it, drawing energy, life from whatever it was. I could see the cracks in the moon spreading from the point of emerge, webbing across the surface like shattered glass. My heart raced as I zoomed in further. That's when I saw them. The eyes. They weren't just on the moon. They were looking back at me. Hundreds, maybe thousands of glowing red eyes stared from within the abyss. Unblinking. Aware. I don't know if they saw me through the telescope or sensed me somehow, but the moment I realized they were staring, everything went wrong. The earth beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, just a tremor at first, but it's been growing. The moon, it's changing, even to the naked eye. I can see the fractures deepening, spreading, as if the entire surface is about to crumble. Something, whatever is inside it, is awakening. I can feel it. This is not a natural phenomenon. It's alive and it's about to break free. I can't explain how I know, but I feel certain that once it emerges, it won't stop with the moon. It will reach Earth. The tendrils, the things crawling across the lunar surface, they're not just staying there. They're spreading. Fast. I keep hearing this humming sound. It started as low as a vibration, but now it's a constant hum in my ears, as if the air itself is charged with some invisible force. I've tried turning off all electronics, but it's still here, growing louder. If you're reading this, I'm warning you. Do not look at the moon. Don't use a telescope. Don't stare at it directly. They can see you. They know when you're watching. I'm sure of it now. I think I've already drawn too much attention. The tremors are getting worse. I can see cracks forming along the edges of the floorboards, and the air is stifling, like it's harder to breathe. I don't know how much longer we have, but it's not long. There's something ancient, something monstrous inside the moon, and it's breaking through. And once it does, there will be no stopping it. I don't know if the government knows, or if anyone else has seen what I've seen, but I'm certain now. This is the end. Not just for me, but for all of us. Please, whoever finds this, spread the word. Stay indoors, stay away from the moon. It's too late for me, but maybe you'll have a chance to survive. The humming, it's deafening now. The walls are shaking. The moon is splitting open. I can see it even without a telescope. The sky is turning a deep, unnatural red. I can't stay here any longer. I need to warn someone, but I don't know if there's anyone left to warn. It's coming. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote, most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families and dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween is a holiday here. It's a test. My family, and others who lived here long enough to know, follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition, it's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believe in the old ways, whether it's spirits or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name. Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death, and each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist, and I'll never forget it. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No, these rules were for everyone. Break one and you'd put us all in danger. Rule number 1. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. Rule number 2. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door, but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving the door, and then shut it. Rule number 3. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. Rule number 4. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a white brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. Rule number 5. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and doors thresholds within 1 minute. Rule number 6. If a candle is burning in the window of the old abandoned Anderson cabin up on the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to go bad. You could just feel it in the holler. Thick in the air, like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all of the preparations done early. Salt the windows now, he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. We're not waiting for the chains. I followed his orders without question, pouring salt along each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, whatever stood on the other side of the door. We never know who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer bread, or you dared to look at it, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across my dad's lap, like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear. Everything had to happen after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. Dad, did we use enough salt this year? Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow Rule 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked, still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. Remember, he said, his voice low and steady. Don't look. He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor, the warm smell of bread, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare to look. Dad held the basket out, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement. And then footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps retreating from the porch. He waited until they faded completely, then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock? Dad's face was pale, and his eyes were hard. We have to wait for the knock, and if you don't answer the knock, it'll come in. We thought it was over. We had followed Rule 2 to the letter, and for a moment, it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadows. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he was there, watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew. We all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. Not for more than a second. I glanced just enough to confirm he was there, a tall, dark figure almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house and sat huddled in the living room. The fire, our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as night crept on. It wasn't until midnight that we heard the chains. At first it was faint, a metallic clicking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind, but it grew louder and closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and door frame. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer. But we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare to look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone, the chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced towards the old Anderson cabin up the hill, and there it was. A single candle still burning in the window. The rules were clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions. No excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of the candle filled me with the primal feel. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed, they're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart, you don't ask questions. Sometimes it's just better not to know. Halloween here has always been terrifying, but last year was different. It was just the usual unease or the normal anxiety that came with the setting sun. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements were slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but no one said anything. We just followed the rules like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of sun. By the time dusk fell, the fire was burning slow, and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, just like every other year. "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door as always. I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound of the crackling fire and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time something was wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the door frame and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise, without thinking, I looked up, I looked at it and saw. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken, like a skull, with pale white skin pulled tight over it. And its eyes were wild. And wide. Too wide. Like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth open unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound I have never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. Its one terrifyingly quick motion. It yanked him off the porch, dragging him towards the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries, and the creature's horrible wail all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac screamed. Bolting for the door, I followed, my legs shaking and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran into the cold night air towards the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it, the candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had to come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. "The cabin." As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry, something that should have not been awakened. "We have to go," I shouted, dragging Isaac back towards the door of our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next roll to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed a bag of salt, getting ready to double-check every line of salt we had placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch. But I knew that the salt would hold. It always did. Or so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to resalt the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush over towards the door to resalt it, I heard the chains and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning for Alex to do the same. Isaac screamed as the front door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom. hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in the front of the door to the bedroom and checked all the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and angry creeping through the house towards us. I don't know how long we waited, or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom and quietly closed the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in the front door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe, for now. And then we heard it. A knock. But not the single knock. And not the 3 knocks. This was something new. Something that didn't fit the rules. It was rapid, frantic pounding, as if whatever was out there wanted in now. My heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows against the wall. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything I had ever felt before. "We wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "We wait until daylight." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep. We didn't dare to move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside of the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through all of it, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow, we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the sounds stopped. The pounding ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin flickered out. We had survived another year. Barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler had always been a test, but last year it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life, and everything is different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse. I've been the mall Santa for years now. It's a pretty easy job. I just need to get into a Santa costume and sit on a chair listening to some kids' wishes. Most kids would wish for toys, games, or other things. I listen and sometimes give a ho ho ho, but one girl stood out to me. She has brown hair, blue eyes, and she couldn't be any more than 6 years old. Before you say it, no, I'm not a predator or anything. There was just one thing about her. When she came to me, she sat on my lap. She didn't have a smile like the other kids did. She said, "Santa, my uncle is so rude. He's so bossy and insults me and Mommy. Can you do something about it?" And I told her, "Don't worry. With the Christmas spirit, Santa can do anything. You just have to believe in it, and everything will be fine." She smiled and I asked what her name was, and she told me it's Elena. She walked away and I felt bad for her. No one should have a trouble uncle like that. As the other kids sat on my lap, I decided for now it's best for me to focus on my job. A year passed before she came again. When she sat on my lap, she wasn't smiling again. She said, "Santa, there's this kid, Brandon, at my school, and he keeps messing with me. And the school doesn't stop him. Can you stop him?" I felt bad. No kid should go through bullying, but what can I do? Well, maybe there's something. I tell her, "Don't worry, Elena. Use the power as last year. Believe in the Christmas spirit. She smiled and said, "Okay, and you remember my name." I let out a ho 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 before saying Santa remembers everyone's names. And of course she left. As another kid sat on my lap, again I felt bad for her, but I had to focus on work again. Finally, the next year came again. This time, her mother seemed sad, and when she sat on my lap, it looked like she was about to cry. She said, "Santa, Mommy's new boyfriend keeps getting angry and hits her and me too." I felt anger that I never felt before. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She said, "Can you use the Christmas spirit again?" And I said, "Yeah, you just have to believe in the Christmas spirit." She left again as another kid sat on my lap. A week went by as I went to the girl's house. I was in the same Santa costume. I went inside the house and saw her new stepfather asleep on the couch. I thought I'd have to wait until he went to the bathroom late at night to confront him or drag him outside his bedroom, but there he was on the bed. I took out a knife and woke him up. As he comprehended everything, he suddenly made a worried face as I slit his throat. I took some stuff and knocked over a lamp to make it look like a robbery as I left the house quietly. It felt right. I doubt Elena knows. Hell, I doubt her mother even knows that I'm her real father. I remember strangling her uncle in that house. His terrified expression made it feel good because of what he had done to my daughter. I remember killing her bully, Brandon, and hiding his body inside a pit in the forest. Ever since Mrs. Segman left me, I never got to see our daughter. But now I did. Eventually, Elena will grow up and stop believing in Santa, but until then, I will get rid of all the bad people in her life and make sure she doesn't have any terrible people around her. Or at least not as many as she would have. I don't care what anyone says. I see what I did as the right thing. That's what fathers should do. Or at least that's what I did. There's not talking to those people. I'm glad I saved Elena from them. Who knows? Maybe I'll see her again one day.